okay, Eros is actually a force of unification. It's completely at odds with the notion of the drive that he introduced himself. And if I say, if I have a simplest sort of answer to how many drives are there, drive as presented in the three essays is something that cannot be totalized. It cannot be seized by one. It is not a common one. And this was precisely the big discussion with Jung, for instance, who said drive is one. It's this all-pervasive vital energy, which various drives are just part of one big thing. And in the three essays, he basically says, he starts off, I don't know if you read the three essays, he starts off not three essays on the theory of sexuality. He says, let's first consider not the theory of sexuality, but the Abirrungen, Abweichungen, the deviations, different kind of deviations in regarding the sexual object or the sexual goal. And he lists all kinds of, he discusses all kinds of possible deviations of sexuality, and then what is his argument? That the very concept of sexual drive actually cannot be described independent from a deviation. It cannot be grasped independent from the constitutive deviation. And if I want to put the argument in a nutshell, Jornades by Bertolt Brecht says, what is a bank robbery in comparison with the establishment of a bank? It's a great image, you know, all these bank robbers, petty thieves, you know, what is this in comparison with this systematic, legalized, long-term robbery accomplished by, you know, banking system? You can see that this adage of Brecht is actually the best motto of our times. We really have bank robbery. I mean, this crisis is the biggest bank robbery in history, but not in the sense that somebody would rob a bank. It's the way that banks rob the whole population as the agents of the robbery. But never mind. I could say that by analogy, what is Freud's argument of this deviation, perversion in these three essays? What are all these perversions, all these deviations from the usual sexual object or goal, in comparison with sexuality as such, which is in itself nothing but a massive deviation? So, sexuality as such is the most spectacular. It's more spectacular than any kind of perverse deviation. This is his argument. Usually one is somehow put in a situation where one will have, and this is kind of free quote Freud, when he speaks about homosexuality. Because usually one is put in a situation where one will have to explain homosexuality as sort of deviation from the norm. Like we take the norm for granted, and we would have to explain why some people differ from the norm. And then he goes on, the sentence goes on, but in psychoanalysis, the sort of normal quasi-chemical attraction between the man and the woman is itself in need of explanation, equally in need of explanation. So he completely reverses the problem. Says it's not the deviation which is the problem, it's the norm which is the problem. The problem is the norm is questioned. This is the question. I mean, this is the normal sexuality, not the answer. Is the question, is the enigma. We have to explain this enigma. There is no chemical attraction. And this is in need of explanation. It's not that deviations that need to be explained. So this is Freud in a nutshell. This is what Lacan tried to pin down by his big slogan. There is no sexual relation, which means that there is precisely no natural attraction which would constitute normalcy. Normalcy is itself in need of explanation. That would be very critical. So, I must come, took a long time, I must come to a kind of conclusion. How many drives are there? They're not to be subsumed under one. sort of all-pervading principle, a substance. The drive, the libido, as this big one. It is not a substance that one could localize or delimit by, like, saying positing sexuality as the determining force, a sort of substratum. It's the very impossibility of such a delimitation, or such a localization of sexuality that constitutes sexuality for Freud. It's precisely the impossibility to localize it to a particular set of human behavior or particular part of human anatomy, precisely because you cannot do it. This is why we have a problem of sexuality. This is what constitutes human sexuality. The question that it cannot be localized as a separate entity. And, well, a simple way of putting it, sexuality for Freud is a universal question. It's not a universal answer. This is how usually psychoanalysis is perceived in zeitgeist. Like, Freud has a universal answer for everything, which is look for something sexual, which would be determining force. But this is really completely at odds with what Freud is saying. It's a question of sexuality. It's not an answer. It's not reducible to biological needs, but also not separable from them. It occurs only in the bosom. It cannot be seized independently. And the Freud saying, so the drive is not one. It cannot be totalized. But also Freud saying drives are two. There is a dualism of the drives. This is the positive and the negative. Let's have this, the binding and the unbinding, determined dualism. This is also a balance. But it's also the answer to say drives are multiple. I don't know if you read, but you enter into the theory event, we have to start from the multiplicity of multiplicities, etc. It's again escaping the paradox. So neither one, nor two, nor multiple. Somehow you run into trouble. They say, well, multiplicity. This is escaping actually the conceptual problem which is at the bottom of this. And this brings us to some sort of core of this problem, which is that the nature of the drive consists in a deviation, a substitution. Symbolic is a sort of obverse side of this deviation, substitution. And the drive somehow is shifted at its origin. It deviates at its origin. It can be seized actually. You know the notion of Klineman, the notion of Klineman which goes back to Epicurus and Lucretius. The notion that something deviates for no reason at all. The deviation is. This is why Althusser was so fond in this. His late writings on the aleatory materialism. He says every other philosophy starts from some founding principle. Only Epicurus starts from a deviation from a founding principle. What was in the beginning? In it was a deviation. There was no founding principle. Deviation is constitutive, as it's. So, if we look at it this way, we never have some sort of natural substratum that culture would then come to restrict. But we have an interface. And an interface where somehow the interface comes before the two faces. We don't have two separate, independent, opposed areas which can be localized and delimited, which would then come into conflict. This very unsatisfactory outcome. But what we have is an interface of tensions and overlaps in this nature and culture, but drives in culture domain. And one can see that the history of psychoanalysis had two big strands. And one big strand is the strands of naturalization and culturalization. One big strand was Freud's strand. And Freud was the man of natural sciences. He was formed as a natural scientist in Brück's laboratory, physiology, etc. And he never gave up on this. He never gave up on this. He wanted psychoanalysis to be a natural science, to have the dignity of a natural science. And sometimes, he says at some point, he presents psychoanalysis as a provisional science. This is the best we can do before we will get to the real physiological, chemical explanation of human behavior. It's an interim science. We need psychoanalysis before we get to the real natural exam. And this program of naturalization of psychoanalysis is now carried out by cognitism. I mean, the whole cognitivist agenda is precisely this: how to put the whole thing on the side of the natural sciences. And on the other side, you have the question of psychoanalysis which has historically made its career as a cultural theory. Where is it taught in university? Well, usually not on the medicine, on the natural sciences side. It's always taught in cultural studies, in philosophy, humanities. Somehow, it's made its career really in humanities. But there is a paradox in this. I mean, what is psychoanalysis? Where does it belong in this division between nature and culture? And one shouldn't adopt either. One shouldn't adopt either. I mean, the moment one says it belongs to humanity, one loses something. Something is lost in this spontaneous division between the two. Something is obfuscated in these two receptions, in these two accounts. And what is lost is the point where neither nature nor culture can be totalized as separate domains. And I think this is the point I've been trying to drive to detotalize. I think this is the really dramatic point, the subversive point of psychoanalysis, to detotalize nature and culture. Not to present them as two neat separate domains which form totalities. This link, this line between drives and culture that we have seen through these 6 traits that Freud enumerates is precisely in this, in the domain where you have the uncertainty, the detotalizing uncertainty of either nature or culture. The nature deviating from itself in the drive, but also culture not being separated from this deviation of nature. You cannot. It's precisely the symptomatic point where you cannot quite say, this is nature, this is culture, this is how it should be opposed. It's the question of nature and culture not being two, not simply being two, forming this neat opposition. It's the symptomatic point which is always obfuscated the moment one totalizes these two entities. So this is what I try to somehow, the point I try to come to. Thank you.
Well, so now it's time for comments and questions, clarifications. Curiosities. There was a moment when you mentioned some kind of parallel between the cultural need or cultural interest to repress sexuality and the problem of technology and biological communities and so on. And you said it like you passed on that, but I didn't quite understand which was the parallelism that you were trying to.
No, I was just trying to make this analogy, which is kind of massive or paradoxical. That, of course, one part of human history was sort of set up an ethics which would control sexuality, which would, restrict it and make it socially acceptable, socially acceptable behavior. And it's kind of very strange to have now the ethical committees being imposed in some sort of parallel analogous way on science, where suddenly you need ethics to restrict this kind of strange drive which science has in itself. I mean, it's a kind of abstract analogy, but I just wanted to sharpen the paradox that there is a sort of libidinal blindness, automatism in the science itself. So it's kind of strange to see that ethics is need to restrict both sexuality and science. What is the function of ethics in that?
But from this point of view, would there be any possibility to rethink ethics from a category of deviation and not from a norm? So to rebuild ethics not in a normative way, in the sense of who is inside and who is outside, but having the standard of the human being as a deviation, as a continuous deviation. That would be my question.
Can one build an ethics on the question of deviation?
Yes, that's it. If it's possible to rethink ethics from this point of view.
Well, you know that there is, one has devoted the whole year, December, to ethics of psychoanalysis.
I know, yes. 77.
And there he tried to come up with a sort of ethics of desire, that not to give up on one's desire, de passer sur son désir. This was his sort of line in ethics, but which is a strange line. It's opposed to two paradigms. The first paradigm would be the usual paradigm when one society is there, ethic is there, to restrict the desires. The desires are sort of antisocial, and we need ethics to kind of tame them. This is one traditional understanding, patriarchal. But then there is the opposite understanding. Desire, let's liberate the desire. And psychoanalysis was always somehow seen as being on this side. Let's lift the restrictions. Let's the restrictions on sexuality. Sexuality is kind of natural, normal. Let's